the heart of this nation, under skies so blue,
there's a spirit that's stirring, values strong and true.
from the mountains to the prairies, from the cities to the sea, we stand for liberty, for faith and family. We're diving deep into the heart of what we believe.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking at the U.S. Mexico border, because there's something pretty big happening down there.
Yeah, these new national defense areas being set up and quite a bit of federal land being transferred to the U.S. Army.
Exactly. And this isn't just some, minor policy tweak. It could really change things for the folks living there and maybe how we approach border security overall.
Definitely. So to really get into it, we've been looking at a detailed piece from csmonitor.com. It came out May 17th, 2025.
Right. And our mission today basically is to figure out what these military zones actually are, why now, and, what kind of impact they're having on the ground. We're sticking close to that article.
Sounds good. So where do we start? The land itself.
Yeah, let's unpack this. The article says it's over 100,000 acres. Federal land, southern New Mexico, western Texas, now called national defense areas, and under Army control.
Okay.
That's a lot of land.
It really is. The specifics are about 109,651 acres from the Bureau of Land Management, the BLM, in New Mexico. That was back in April.
Yeah.
And then in May, another roughly 2,000 acres were added in western Texas. That came from the International Boundary and Water Commission. And get this, it includes part of the Rio Grande River itself.
Wow, the river too. And how long is this arrangement for?
Well, the article states these transfers are set for 3 years, at least for now.
Okay, 3 years. And the military's reason, what they're saying publicly, the article mentions it's pretty direct, detaining trespassers?
Right. Both unauthorized immigrants and, interestingly, U.S. citizens, too, if they trespass.
But has that actually happened? Have they detained anyone?
Well, according to the report, no actual detentions by the military have occurred so far. That's a key point.
Right.
But they do claim they've helped Border Patrol assisted in spotting, I think the number was over 150 unauthorized trespassers.
So more of a support role in practice currently.
Seems like it, yeah. But the designation itself, this national defense area thing, the article stresses that this is really the first time we've seen this exact approach. It's described as first of its kind.
And this isn't just happening in a vacuum, right? The article connects it to President Trump's actions earlier this year.
Exactly. It's presented as part of that military surge President Trump directed after declaring the national emergency at the border back on January 20th.
So it fits into that larger picture, the whole of government crackdown on illegal immigration that the article mentions.
Yes. But here's a really interesting piece of context the article brings up. All this is happening when illegal border crossings are reportedly, way down.
Way down. How much?
At their lowest levels in at least 25 years, according to the reporting.
25 years. Wow. Okay, so previous presidents, they've used the military at the border before, but maybe more for support, right? Like logistics or surveillance?
That's generally been the case, yes, support roles. But this move, creating these specific national defense areas, the article calls it novel. And it's definitely raising some legal eyebrows.
Right. That context of falling numbers is crucial. The article mentions a peak in encounters, then a drop, and then a real plunge. Why the big drop?
It attributes that steep decline to harsher consequences. Things like potentially ending up in foreign prison cells. The numbers for April, for instance, were just 8,383 encounters.
And how does that compare?
That's down 93% from April of the previous year. A massive decrease.
93%. Okay. So let's pivot to those legal questions you mentioned. The article brings up the Posse Comitatus Act. Remind us what that is.
Sure. Posse Comitatus, it's an old law, goes back to 1878, and basically it limits the use of the U.S. military for domestic law enforcement. You generally can't use the Army or Air Force to enforce civilian laws within the U.S.
Okay. So how does that apply here? Because the military has supported immigration agencies before.
Right. They've done things like surveillance, intelligence gathering, logistical support. But critics, as cited in the article, see these new national defense zones as something different. They worry it's an attempt to, sidestep that law, to essentially militarize the border in a new way.
And the Department of Defense, how are they positioning this?
Their framing seems to be that these areas are essentially just extensions of existing Army bases, like Fort Bliss in Texas and Fort Huachuca in Arizona.
Does that make it legally okay then? if it's just part of a base.
Well, that's the debate. The article quotes Professor Chris Mirasola from the University of Houston Law Center. He suggests, apprehending someone clearly on a designated military installation is probably legal.
Yeah.
But his concern is about how much additional law enforcement activity the military might undertake within these large, newly designated zones. That's where he thinks lawsuits could really start popping up.
Yeah, that seems like a gray area. The article also has a statement from Sergeant First Class Kent Redmond. He says Joint Task Force personnel do not conduct law enforcement operations.
Right, which sounds a bit contradictory if the stated purpose is detaining trespassers, doesn't it?
It does. How do you detain someone for trespassing if you're not conducting law enforcement? It's confusing.
It really highlights the potential ambiguity here. Maybe the line they're drawing is very fine.
Okay.
It's also worth noting, the article points out a land transfer back in 2019, 560 acres, for border barriers.
Okay.
But that land wasn't designated a national defense area. So that label, that specific designation, seems to be the key legal or administrative shift here.
So what is the Pentagon's official definition of a national defense area, according to the article?
They define it as federal land, where the Pentagon maintains administrative authority and jurisdiction and is permitted to establish and enforce a controlled perimeter and access.
Right. So control and access, and they're putting up signs.
Yes, warning signs.
Yes.
In English and Spanish. Basically saying, enter here and you could be detained, you could be searched.
So imagine you live nearby. Land that maybe you used to hike on or ranchers used for grazing under BLM rules. Now it's potentially off limits under military control.
Exactly. That's a big change on the ground level.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the local reaction, right? The article paints a picture of, mixed feelings.
Yeah. Hope, distrust, and uncertainty was the phrase used.
A very fitting description. You've got some locals who seem to welcome it, hoping it deters illegal crossings more effectively.
More boots on the ground. Maybe they see it that way.
Perhaps. But then there's real concern, too. Distrust, uncertainty about what this actually means day to day. It really shows that tension in border communities, doesn't it? Between wanting security and worrying about, militarization.
And part of that uncertainty seems to stem from just a lack of communication. Local authorities being out of the loop.
That definitely seems to be the case, reading the article. Sheriff Kim Stewart in Doña Ana County, New Mexico. Her county includes some of this land. She apparently hadn't even seen a map of the new zone.
No map. Seriously.
And hadn't been contacted by the Defense Department directly. Her big concern was about coordination, needing organized help, she called it. Especially for serious things, like if someone dies within these zones, who handles the investigation?
That seems like a pretty basic question that needs answering. What does the article say about coordination?
It states that Customs and Border Protection, CBP, which includes Border Patrol, is supposed to lead coordination with local law enforcement.
Okay.
And that Border Patrol agents will keep operating in these areas, and they'd refer death investigations to local authorities. But clearly, based on Sheriff Stewart's comments, that communication or clarity hasn't fully trickled down.
Yeah, seems like a gap there. And this confusion, it's apparently even showing up in court.
It is. The article mentions the U.S. attorney in New Mexico charging hundreds of people, 472, I think, with violating a security regulation linked to the New Mexico zone. That could mean up to a year in prison.
Wow. But then, didn't a judge throw some cases out?
Yes, that's the other side of it. A federal magistrate judge dismissed trespassing charges against almost 100 unauthorized immigrants.
On what grounds?
The judge found the government hadn't actually proven that those individuals knew they were entering a restricted military area, which speaks volumes about the lack of clarity, the signage, or maybe just the general awareness of these new zones.
That's a significant legal pushback. Now, within the local communities, the opinions really seem to vary quite a bit. You mentioned some support it.
Yeah, like Sheriff William Chadbourne in Hidalgo County. That's way out in the western boot heel of New Mexico. He apparently sees the military presence as a helpful deterrent, even though he also wasn't directly told about the expansion affecting his area.
And there was a farmer mentioned.
Jennifer Ivey, yes.
Yeah.
Runs a pecan farm in Clint, Texas. She approves, citing gaps in the border fence near her property and past security worries like finding deceased migrants or farm workers quitting because of gunfire nearby.
So real-world security concerns driving her view.
Definitely. But she also mentioned wanting more clarity on who to call the military or border patrol if something happens. So even among supporters, there's this need for clear information.
But not everyone's on board, even those who deal with crossings regularly.
Not at all. Robert Ardovino in Sunland Park, New Mexico, he sees unauthorized crossings near his place all the time, but he's quoted saying he's not interested in the military militarizing that border.
So a principled opposition to the military's role there.
Seems like it. And he's also frustrated about not knowing if land he uses is now under DOD control. Then there's Jerry Pacheco from the Border Industrial Association. He raises a different point in economics.
Ah, the business perspective.
Right. He talks about challenging optics, worrying that this heavy military presence might make the region look, in his words, like the Gaza Strip to foreign companies thinking about investing there. Not exactly a welcoming image.
That's a really stark comparison. So the concerns aren't just about immediate safety or legality, but also the broader image and economic future.
Precisely. And it doesn't stop there. Environmental groups are also raising red flags, according to the article.
What's their main concern?
Habitat fragmentation, mostly. They argue that more militarization, more border wall construction, it just carves up ecosystems that wildlife depend on, especially in these sensitive desert areas.
Makes sense.
Michelle Lute from Wildlife for All is quoted calling this military takeover, done without specific congressional approval for these zones, a dangerous precedent.
A precedent for what?
For potentially using national security claims to bypass environmental laws and the usual democratic processes for managing public lands.
And the military's response to that?
Sergeant Redman, quoted again in the article, basically says that while they aren't directly managing endangered species by reducing unauthorized crossings, they'll indirectly help protect those resources. Kind of an indirect benefit argument.
Okay. And finally, what about immigrant advocates? Predictably, they're opposed.
Strongly opposed. People like Fernando Garcia from the Border Network for Human Rights. They see this as just another step towards militarizing the border and further criminalizing people trying to immigrate.
How does he put it?
Garcia argues the government is, quote, distorting the deployment to make it look legal and constitutional. But he believes the real purpose is simply based on containing immigration.
So a fundamental disagreement on the intent and legality.
Absolutely. His group even held a march in El Paso, carrying American flags, a big copy of the Constitution, really emphasizing themes of inclusion and rights in response to this.
Okay, so bringing this all together, we've covered a lot from that CS Commenter article. What are the main things that stick out as we wrap up?
Well, first, just the fact of these unprecedented military zones being established. It's a new chapter in border management. Second, the significant legal and constitutional questions hanging over them, especially around posse comitatus and the military's role.
Right.
And third, the really diverse, often conflicted reactions on the ground from locals, from officials, from advocacy groups. There's no single view down there. It's complicated.
Definitely complicated. Hope, distrust, uncertainty. It seems to capture it well. It's clearly a novel approach tied to this administration's focus on border security, but it's generating a lot of debate.
For sure.
So a final thought maybe for you, the listener, to chew on. Given all these legal questions, the mixed local feelings, what are the long-term implications here? If this becomes the new normal, what does it mean for how the U.S. handles its borders and maybe even the role of the military inside the country?
Yeah, big questions with no easy answers right now.
Definitely something to keep watching. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Make it make sense. Protecting human rights. Humans' rights back from wars and prisons. Deep dive podcast show. Let's dive in the heart of this nation, under skies so blue, there's a spirit that's stirring, values strong and true. From the mountains to the prairies, from the cities to the sea, we stand for liberty, for faith and family. We're diving deep into the